The key question is, how important was Count Cavour in the creation of a united and independent Italy? Cavour became prime minister with an expert knowledge of economic and financial affairs, and under his guidance, Piedmont undoubtedly became a more developed and richer state. Its trade increased in value by 300% in the 1850s, its industries flourished, and its railways became the envy of Italy. Yet, in 1852, Cavour had only limited knowledge and understanding of foreign affairs. In the 1830s, he had expressed a vague wish that Italy should be united and free from Austrian domination. He hoped, he said, for the soonest possible emancipation of Italy from the barbarians who oppress her, but was worried because a crisis of at least some violence is inevitable. He wanted this crisis to be restrained as the state of things allowed, because he feared that revolutionary movements, with their own stress on republicanism and social upheaval, would only make unity more difficult to achieve. But too much should not be read into these remarks, for in the 1850s he still referred on a number of occasions to the ideas of Italian unity as rubbish. Probably he did not begin to see it as a realistic aim until 1859. Cavour quickly gained the experience in foreign affairs. 2 years after he took office, an international crisis led to the start of the Crimean War. Traditionally, Cavour has been seen as happily joining in the war against Russia in order to gain the friendship of Britain and France and to be sure of some of the spoils, as well as a seat at the eventual peace conference. Undoubtedly, this motive did influence his decision to join the war. Cavour was the second son of a rich noble, and he will serve as prime minister throughout the period of unification. The 9 years of Cavour's prime ministership were some of the most monumentous in the history of Italy. By the time of his death, all of Italy, apart from Venetia and Rome, had been unified. Controversy centers on how important his role was in this process, and on whether he actually intended that the Italian peninsula, rather than merely northern Italy, should be united. Cavour's speech to Parliament in 1855 presented his vision of a new Italy, whose international reputation would be improved, further by sending young men to fight in the war rather than staying at home and taking part in revolutions, plots, and conspiracies, which had damaged Italy's reputation abroad. Nevertheless, there is evidence that Cavour was doubtful. He was swayed by the king, who was eager to take part in the conflict, and also by Britain and France. These countries put pressure on Cavour, partly because they knew that additional Piedmontese troops would be useful in the conflict, and partly because of a more subtle motive. They wanted Austria as well as Piedmont to join the war, and they reasoned that if both of these states were on the same side, the Austrians would be reassured that Piedmont would not interfere in Lombardy. Either way, by joining in the war, Cavour did achieve his aim of a seat at the peace conference held in Paris in 1856. There he was able to negotiate on almost equal terms with the great powers, and there he also made the further acquaintance of Louis Napoleon, now Emperor Napoleon III. They kept in touch over the next 2 years until, in July 1858, Cavour was invited to a meeting at Plombieres, close to the Franco-Swiss border. The meeting was kept very secret. Even the French foreign minister was not aware of what was happening. Cavour was equally secretive. He had told only Victor Emmanuel and one other minister about the meeting, which was beginning to look like a conspiracy. Whose were the proposals discussed at Plombieres? Napoleon had issued the invitation and organized the meeting. It might be expected that the meeting's agenda would be his, but there is evidence to suggest that Cavour took with him an outline memorandum that consisted of proposals very similar to what was finally agreed. 3 days later, on July 24th, Cavour sat down and wrote a very long and detailed letter to Victor Emmanuel II, giving his version of the discussion. He wrote, "As soon as I entered the emperor's study, he raised the question which was the purpose of my journey. He began by saying that he had decided to support Piedmont with all his power in a war against Austria, provided that the war was undertaken for non-revolutionary end, which could be justified in the eyes of diplomatic circles and still more in the eyes of the French and European public opinion." Both men were aware that unless the war seemed reasonable to European leaders, Austria might find allies. Certainly Prussia made it clear that it might support her German neighbor Austria, and even Britain, though generally sympathetic to Italian aspirations, would not support a war of unprovoked aggression. Furthermore, the powers were fearful that Austrian domination might well be replaced by French control. If this fear proved justified, there might have been a coalition of powers to defeat this new Napoleon. The ideal solution, of course, would be if Austria could be maneuvered into declaring war, but failing this, what might be a suitable issue on which France and Piedmont could start a war with Austria? The search for a plausible excuse presented our main problem, Cavour told his king. He suggested that the Austrian emperor had broken certain commercial agreements and had extended his territory in Italy further than treaties allowed. But the Emperor Napoleon did not like these because he could hardly complain about Austrian domination in northern Italy when the French army was in Rome. So his position became embarrassing, and Cavour could not find a reason. Unable to find a suitable excuse for France and Piedmont to make war on Austria and drive it out of Italy, the two men focused instead on how a future Austrian Free Italy would be organized. Basically, they would create 4 states with the Pope loosely in charge of this confederation. Cavour told his king that this arrangement was fully acceptable. Victor Emmanuel would become the legal sovereign of the richest and most powerful half of Italy, and hence would, in practice, dominate the whole peninsula. Next, Louis Napoleon and Cavour considered what benefits France might receive from fighting a war against Austria. Cavour wrote to King Victor Emmanuel II, "The Emperor asked me whether Your Majesty would cede Savoy and the county of Nice. I answered that Your Majesty believed in the principle of nationalities and realized accordingly that Savoy ought to be reunited with France, and that consequently you were prepared to make this sacrifice, even though it be extremely painful, to renounce the country which had been the cradle of your family, and whose people had given your ancestors so many proofs of affection and devotion. The question of Nice was different, because the people of Nice, by origin, language, and customs, were closer to Piedmont than to France. It's also worth noting that Nice was the home city of Garibaldi." Hence a deal was almost struck. Napoleon estimated that an army of around 300,000 men would be needed to drive Austria out of Italy. He would provide 200,000 in Piedmont and the other Italian states 100,000. Italy would become 4 states loosely grouped under the Pope as a figurehead. As a reward, France would receive Savoy. Whether Nice would also be handed over was at this stage uncertain. The diplomatic ground would have to be prepared carefully so that Austria would have no allies. Hence, a good excuse for war would have to be found, although as yet neither Cavour nor Napoleon could devise one. A provisional agreement was also reached for a marriage between Victor Emmanuel's eldest daughter, Clothilde, and one of Napoleon's cousins. The arrangements reached at Plombieres were largely incorporated into a secret treaty in January 1859, although some changes were made. In particular, Nice was added to Savoy as Napoleon's proposed reward, and the idea of an Italian confederation headed by the Pope was abandoned. But would these plans ever come to fruition? Could a suitable pretext for war be devised? In the end, Cavour, being appointed prime minister in 1852, increased both the domestic and foreign policies of Piedmont and leads them to become the strongest state in Italy, and as a result, the only candidate to lead unification.